July 17, 1999, 6:42 a.m., Wichita Falls, Texas. A tan Chevy Lumina idles in a driveway that still holds last night's heat. Four adults climb in with coffee and a paper map folded to Arkansas Scenic Byway 7. 40 miles from the Oklahoma line, they promise to call at noon. Then they're gone. What happened to the Whitaker family between that hour and sunset? 20 years later, 7:12 a.m., Newton County, Arkansas, a different morning will tug a hidden thread. The past will answer, just not kindly, and never all at once. One habit, 1 mile marker, changed everything that morning. Nathan Whitaker watched the taillights fade as if the road swallowed them. He was 22, sore from a night shift and a summer class exam, and convinced missing one family vacation didn't matter. His father, Mark, had tapped the roof twice, his ritual, before easing the car into gear. Elaine had checked the map again. Rachel teased Nathan for sleeping in his boots. Leah waved with a tired smile that said she'd rather be behind the wheel. Grown kids now, but still orbiting their parents' plans like planets that forgot they'd learned to fly. Nathan told himself he'd lock the shop, finish invoices, and catch up on sleep. He told himself a lot of things. Whitaker Home Repairs was a one-bay garage with a handmade sign and a coffee maker that misfired more than the engines Nathan fixed. He spent that Saturday installing a storm door for a neighbor and replacing a cracked disposal, little jobs that made the silence feel useful. The house kept their shape. His father's measuring tape on the workbench. His mother's recipe cards with grease smudges. Rachel's spool of yarn from a street fair. Leah's stack of cheap paperbacks she swore she'd return to the library. Every object said, "Back soon." Every room said, "Hold that thought." At noon the phone didn't ring. By 2 o'clock he dialed his father, then his mother, then Rachel, then Leah. The calls went to voicemail, a new technology that felt older than dust. He told himself reception could be spotty in the hills. He paced. He washed his hands and found he had nothing left to clean. The sun slid toward evening and the house learned a new sound. His breathing when he tried not to think. He slept in a chair near the door, as if listening could bend geography. On Sunday morning he drove the first leg of their route, just to feel the turns they would have taken. US 287 south, then east, counting the miles out loud the way his father had taught him on job sites. 8, 17, 31. He stopped at a diner where the waitress knew his family and asked about pie. She'd seen them last summer. "They tip in exact change," she said, smiling. "Kindness down to the penny." He laughed because it hurt more not to. By Monday he'd filed a report. By Friday he'd learned how quickly a file number becomes a wall. Years are heavy only when you try to lift them. Nathan learned to stack them instead. He kept the business going. He paid the mortgage on a house that refused to forget. He hoarded small rituals, tuning a carburetor by ear, counting floor joists by touch, tapping the dashboard twice before starting any engine. He built a life that looked like waiting from the outside. Inside it looked like endurance. July 18, 2019, the phone finally rang with the voice he'd trained himself to expect and fear. "Mr. Whitaker? This is the Arkansas State Police." The woman's tone was formal but not cold, a kind of practiced gentleness he recognized from the worst days at the hospital where his mother had volunteered. "My name is Detective Mara Ellison." A land surveyor flying a drone over Newton County documented something unusual in a remote area. "We need a family member for preliminary identification." The words landed with dull weight, each one a nail tapped once, then twice. "Unusual how?" he asked. "We'd rather show you than describe it," she said. "And we want to be careful with conclusions before we've put hands and eyes on the ground." She gave him a meeting time, tomorrow, 9 a.m., Arkansas State Police Troop J headquarters in Clarksville, and a name to ask for at the front desk. She asked if he had someone to drive with him. He said no. She told him to bring anything that might help. Copies of registrations, photos, even the kind of details people think don't matter. He opened the closet where his mother had filed everything in labeled folders. "Vehicle, 1997 Lumina," the tab said, because she labeled hope the same way she labeled sugar. He set the folder beside a Ziploc bag with 5 pennies his father had once called Lucky Solder. He packed Rachel's crocheted swatch and one of Leah's paperbacks because artifacts sometimes make strangers into witnesses. He slept 3 hours, woke at 3:11 a.m., and wrote down what he could still hear from that last morning: the double tap on the roof, the squeak in the driver's seat, the way his father always adjusted the mirror twice because once felt like superstition. He wrote down the route, not as lines on a map but as muscle memory. The first hill after the city line. The billboard with the faded ranch hand. The turn where your stomach lifts and you feel 9 years old again. It was a blueprint of absence, and he measured it like a repair. On the drive east before dawn, the highway felt predatory. Headlights slid by like thoughtless comets. Trucks breathed in the lane beside him. He kept both hands at 10 and 2 and counted miles because numbers keep their promises. Somewhere past the state line, his chest stopped hurting and something colder moved in. The kind of calm you only get when the future has decided you don't get a vote. He pulled into the Clarksville lot at 8:52 a.m., 8 minutes early because he always was. He sat with the engine off and the windows cracked and listened to a morning he couldn't name yet. Detective Ellison would walk him through a door. He would step over a threshold he'd been circling for 20 years. The truth might not be there. It might be somewhere deeper, waiting with its back turned. He needed to see that too. He picked up the folder and the bag and the 2 small objects that had pretended to be ordinary for 2 decades. He tapped the steering wheel twice, like always. Then he whispered the only question that mattered and the only one that might still change shape when spoken aloud. What exactly did you find out there? Detective Mara Ellison met Nathan in a windowless briefing room that smelled faintly of toner and coffee. She didn't waste words. A land surveyor mapping timber parcels with a drone had flagged an anomaly northwest of Jasper, she said. The images suggested a sinkhole. The shadows suggested layers. Her voice stayed even, but the photos she slid across the table made the room feel smaller by half. Ellison asked for anything personal that might help with identification, and Nathan set down a plastic bag with a crocheted swatch the color of late summer hay, a paperback with Leah's name on the inside cover, and a folder labeled, in his mother's hand, Vehicle, 1997 Lumina. He had packed proof of an ordinary life. They drove out as the sun burned away the morning haze. The roads narrowed, trees closing like a zipper. At the perimeter, yellow tape fluttered between oaks, and a generator thumped a steady pulse. Colton Reeves, the surveyor who'd flown the drone, met them in muddy boots and a ball cap. "Never seen anything like this," he said, not proudly. He pointed them to the ridge, where floodlights threw a hard glare into the Earth's open mouth. From above, the sinkhole didn't look natural. The shape was too regular, the edges too worked, as if the forest had been trained to keep a secret. Cars weren't tumbled. They were placed. Sedans wedged under SUVs to save space. Minivans fitted nose to tail in tidy arcs. Rust had softened them into one color, the way time makes strangers look related. Nathan recognized the Lumina by the curve of its rear glass and the little ripple in the passenger door his father never got around to fixing. He had told himself this moment would be a relief, an answer at last. It wasn't. Answers can feel like the floor giving way at a familiar threshold. A rope team clipped harnesses to Ellison and 2 techs. Nathan stayed at the rim until she called up, voice calm but changed. "I need you to see something," she said, and that was how he found himself stepping into a harness he didn't trust and lowering past 20 years of choices, breath loud in his ears, hands burning against the belay. The air grew colder a few feet down, with a mineral smell that didn't belong to any season. Up close, the Lumina looked smaller than his memory allowed. He brushed away lichen from the rear glass with the back of his glove and saw scratch marks shallow as whispers. Not a sentence. Not neat. But letters held. FINDUS. He stared until the shapes separated from coincidence. Someone had pressed metal to glass and tried to make a word into a rescue. Ellison's light moved in a slow arc, drawing lines across the trunk, the bumper, the seal. "We'll photograph it, preserve it, then move to the interior," she said. He nodded because his voice had nothing useful to add. The passenger door gave with a moan. Inside, cloth had gone to threads and foam, and the smell carried the blunt truth of years. Between the seat and the console, something pale caught the beam. Ellison worked tweezers under it and held up a frayed loop. Nathan didn't have to touch it to know it. Rachel made those loops while waiting for oil changes, for water to boil, for life to begin. He had called the habit old-fashioned. She had called it useful. Ellison slid it into a bag, labeled it, and allowed herself one small beat of stillness before moving on. In the back, a dog-eared library card stuck to torn fabric. The plastic had clouded, but the branch stamp read Fayetteville in a fading purple. The card number was mostly intact. Leah had rolled her eyes when Nathan teased her about returns. "They need readers, Nate," she'd said. "Fines are just love notes." He smiled despite the acid in his throat. Love notes survive. That's the logic grief can't break. Ellison lifted a crushed paper map from the footwell and unfolded enough to reveal a line drawn in pencil along Byway 7. Mark's handwriting made the route look inevitable. A tech swabbed the wheel and the door handle without drama. Routine can be a kindness in places like this. Another tech called from 2 stacks over, radio clipped to his collar. Partial plate on a blue pickup. Reported stolen in 2001. The name he read next belonged to a family Nathan didn't know and suddenly did. From the rim, Reeves yelled that ground-penetrating radar was lighting up a ring of disturbances beyond the hole. Shallow, broad anomalies like posts set into the earth and cut off clean. Not a graveyard, Ellison said later, because that word romanticizes what people choose to become numb to. More like a ledger that needed dirt to balance. Back topside, Nathan stood among clipped voices and the smell of hot generators, not a guest and not quite family. Ellison briefed him on next steps in simple words. They would grid, document, extract, and respect the order of the work. If he wanted to step away, she would understand. He didn't. He asked for a minute alone at the tape. He closed his eyes and gave himself exactly 60 seconds. He'd learned on job sites that too much time to think makes cuts crooked. For those who track cases like this, it's the moment to lean in and stay with it. Timelines are a kind of map, and the map is about to change scale. 10 feet from where he stood, a second path had been marked in fluorescent paint, the kind they use when they want tired eyes to notice. He followed it with his gaze until it bent toward a darker stand of trees that swallowed the color whole. Somewhere behind those trunks, someone had practiced, then practiced again. When Ellison turned back, phone to her ear, her eyes met his and held. "We need a name," she said softly. "Not for a body. For whoever thought this was efficient." Whose hands arranged the cars like a ledger's columns? Detective Mara Ellison started with paper, not theories. She requested title histories for the Lumina and every Whitaker vehicle on file, then expanded the circle to cars bought within 6 months of the disappearance from lots along Arkansas Scenic Byway 7. Patterns don't shout, they repeat. The Department of Finance sent photocopies with date stamps that looked like freckles, and one name surfaced with quiet persistence: Keaton Auto Plaza, Russellville. The Whitakers bought their car there in June 1999. So did 3 other families who never finished their vacations that same summer. Ellison didn't call it more than coincidence yet. She circled the dates and wrote them in a thin column that looked like fence posts hammered into white space. Nathan remembered the day his father signed. The lot had string lights, even in daylight, and a salesman who smiled like he'd already decided to be your neighbor. Harold Keaton offered a bottle of cold water from a cooler and asked, almost as an afterthought, what route they liked to take. "7's the prettiest," Mark said. "Quiet in July if you start early." Harold nodded as if that were simply weather. Nathan had been 22 and impatient with small talk that felt nosy. Now, the memory's edges had teeth. Ellison drove them to Russellville in a state sedan that didn't rattle. Keaton Auto Plaza was still there, smaller than Nathan remembered, the flags faded to pastel. Inside, a corkboard held snapshots of customers beside their cars. A whole wall of grins. Harold Keaton himself came out from an office that smelled like lemon cleaner and old carpet. He had a handshake that tried to set tempo. Ellison showed her badge and asked for sales records from 1998 through 2001. He squinted like he was looking into sun and said the computer system only went back 15 years. "Papers in storage," he added. "We're a simple operation." Simple is a word people use when they want to flatten questions. Ellison asked for the storage address. While he wrote it down, Nathan drifted to the photo board. He found a snapshot of his parents and sisters beside the Lumina, mid-laugh, caught in that silly open-mouthed joy of signing a thing you've saved for. Someone had written Whitaker, safe travels, in marker. The exclamation point looked like an arrow with no target. The storage unit was an oven. They wore gloves and worked in the dust of other people's big purchases. Ellison set banker boxes on the floor, sorted by month, then by make. She read out dates, he read out names. When you read the missing out loud, even one at a time, the room changes shape. In box after box, Ellison flagged families who disappeared within months of buying here. 11 over a decade, scattered across years and counties, never enough to set off alarms in one place. Together, they looked like a ledger someone hoped no one would balance. She cross-referenced claim files next. Bluegate Insurance came up like a drumbeat. Comprehensive coverage, quick payouts on total loss, adjuster signature, Brenda Lowell. Nathan stared at that neat cursive until the LS felt personal. Ellison called Bluegate from the car and asked for Lowell's employment dates. 96 to 04, the voice said. We can scan and send log extracts. Ellison's pen paused above her pad at that range. It caught almost all of the names they had. Almost. At the office, Ellison pinned a road map to a corkboard and made small pencil marks along Byway 7. The pins drifted toward a stretch of roadway south of Pelser where the line tightens and cellular bars go to 0. She measured distances, counted drive times, and didn't trust gut when math would do. If someone wanted the fewest cameras, the least traffic, and a reason to stop a car that doesn't invite questions, she said, they'd take them right here. She placed the pencil on mile marker 52 and left it there. She requested call logs and incident reports from Searcy County for the week the Whitakers vanished. Most were noise, livestock on a roadway, a civil standby, a welfare check in Marshall that ended with an unable to locate. Then a blank hour in the patrol schedule. A deputy assigned to the stretch near 52 had a gap between traffic stops that ended precisely where Keaton's customers would have driven at daybreak. The deputy later transferred and retired early. His old supervisor, Sheriff Boyd Wilcox, had pushed retirement papers through in 2011, a year before an internal audit that suggested sloppy evidence chains and missing fuel receipts. Sloppy isn't a crime, but it makes a good hiding place for one. Ellison and Nathan visited the gas station near Pelser where the locals taped business cards to a bulletin board for chainsaw sharpening and small engine repair. The clerk had worked summers there since high school. She remembered the Whitakers because Mark had fixed her grandmother's porch rail the year before when it twisted free in a storm. Good man, she said, and then she did a thing witnesses rarely do. She volunteered a detail in the middle of her own sentence. That morning, a county cruiser idled on the shoulder down past the bend, she said, eyes going to a place the rest of her stayed behind. Lights off. Windows up. Just waiting. Ellison didn't flinch. You make note of the unit number? The clerk shook her head. But the guy driving always got coffee here. Sheriff Wilcox's nephew. Used to leave the cup on the pump. She mimed the habit like muscle memory. They drove back in quiet and let the radio fill the car with a ballgame neither of them heard. At the office, Ellison called a friend in Little Rock who owed her 2 favors and asked for any disciplinary notes on the nephew deputy. While she waited, she opened a brown envelope that had arrived from Bluegate. The scan logs showed Lowell processing claims within 2 to 3 weeks of lost date, often citing unrecoverable vehicle, assumed theft, remote roadway. The memos were cut and paste, efficient to a fault. One file had a comment box with a name she hadn't expected to see. Keaton, Harold, assisted with paperwork. She looked at Nathan, then at the wall map, then at the pencil still parked on 52. People build machines out of their habits, she said. The wrong habit in the right job is a machine. Her phone rang. The favor came through. You were right, the voice said. The nephew resigned after a complaint that never went to IA, sealed summary. Supervisor's signature, Boyd Wilcox. Ellison thanked him, hung up, and reached for her keys. Harold Keaton sells cars, Nathan said. Why would he risk anything more than that? Some people don't see risk, she said. They see opportunity disguised as routine. And then she told him the part he hadn't prepared for since morning. They were going back to Keaton Auto Plaza, not to page boxes, but to ask a neighborly man a set of questions that didn't leave room for charm. By the time they turned onto the lot, the photo board had one snapshot missing where the Whitakers' picture should have been, and the thumbtack still hanging there was bright red. Harold Keaton didn't blink when Detective Mara Ellison walked back into his showroom with Nathan at her shoulder. Sun-lit dust in the glass, and the wall of customer snapshots smiled like they knew better. Ellison asked for 10 minutes in his office. He gestured wide, as if to say he had all the time in the world. Time is exactly what he had run out of. She didn't accuse him. She arranged facts on his desk like tools pulled from a bag, sales ledgers from the storage unit, purchase dates lined against disappearances, Bluegate claim logs with Brenda Lowell's signature repeating like a stamp. "You sell honest cars to families who vanish at an unusual rate," she said. "We're trying to understand the overlap." Harold steepled his fingers and caught Nathan looking at the empty space on the corkboard where the Whitaker photo had hung for 2 decades. "I take care of people," Harold said. "I remember names. I remember routes. Folks like Byway 7. Pretty Drive." He smiled too slowly when he realized what he'd said. It only took that one sliver of precision, routes, plural, remembered, spoken in the present tense. Ellison let silence sit between them until it found its own weight. Nathan broke first. "You remember my father saying that?" he said. "You remember the exact road." Harold's eyes flicked to a file cabinet, not out of guilt but habit, and Ellison had her tell. "We'll need to secure your records," she said, standing. "You can consent or we can formalize it." He shrugged, a small performance of irritation, and nodded to consent. Some men don't believe in the possibility of a different ending. 2 hours later, an FBI van parked behind the building. Agent Daniel Ruiz, patient as a carpenter, supervised the transfer of boxes and a beige desktop tower that still wore a sticker for a long-dead antivirus program. Harold watched from the sales floor with his arms crossed, jaw set like he'd chewed something bitter and decided to swallow anyway. "Routine inventory," he told a salesman who asked with his eyes. "We're cooperating." Cooperation has grades. This was the kind where you don't fight because you're sure you can spin it later. In a back office, Ruiz imaged the hard drive and printed a directory list that started out dull, then sharpened. A folder named Delivery contained subfolders by last name. Inside each, a typed sheet with more than financing, more than odometer readings. Departure, destination, preferred route, estimated stop, insurance value, family members, count only. The Whitaker file sat between a Martinez and a Cole. Under Notes, a single line, Early Start, Quiet Stretch, then 52. Ruiz didn't look at Nathan. There was no respectful way to. He slid the copy into an evidence sleeve and kept his voice level. "Mr. Whitaker, we will never ask you to identify intent. That's our job. But your father left a map. Someone else annotated it." Harold's version of calm collapsed when Ruiz carried out the ledger. It wasn't even well hidden, false bottom in the bottom drawer, the hardware store kind. Columns for dates, 3 sets of initials rotated in neat order, amounts that lined up exactly with Bluegate payouts minus a quiet fee for paperwork. Ellison traced the initials with a capped pen. HK for Harold. BL for Brenda Lowell. The third didn't need letters to be recognizable. The same hand had signed off on Searcy County fuel sheets a decade ago. "Wilcox," she said almost to herself. "Of course." Harold opened his hands and said nothing. A man who made a practice of neighborliness had mistaken repetition for innocence. Under questioning, he tried the oldest door first. He was a detail man who kept good records. He didn't know where families went after they left his lot. He tried the second door. People tell car dealers too much and he'd been foolish to write any of it down. When neither door opened, he tried to move the walls. "You can't make murder out of lines on a page," he said. Ruiz didn't argue. He put a photo in front of Harold instead. A ridge of trees near Pelser, a footpath fading to a darker square in the undergrowth. "Show us," Ruiz said, where Sheriff Wilcox preferred to camp. The cabin site was less a structure than a memory of one. Stone footings, a collapsed roof, weeds staking their claims in patient angles. Dr. Aisha Patel, compact and precise, flagged a shallow depression that read wrong on ground-penetrating radar. Not a single pit. A rectangle with internal partitions, the kind of space someone makes to store what they're afraid to name. Every step was documented. Every scrap bagged. No graphic revelations, no theatrics, just the steady, disciplined gathering of proof. Under a rotting plank, Patel lifted a canvas pouch tied with baling wire. Inside, personal effects that time had tried to erase and failed to finish. A thin silver band etched with 2 letters. R and L, Rachel and Leah. Nathan felt the world tilt without moving. Ellison's hand was already at his elbow without touching, the kind of steadiness that lets a person stand up in a room that isn't built for grief. Ruiz let the cabin breathe while he worked the phone. A warrant expanded. A judge briefed. A request for sealed personnel files moved up a queue. Somewhere between the calls, Harold stopped insisting on misunderstandings and started rearranging his future. He wanted a deal. He could outline the division of labor. He could sketch the shape of a scheme that thrived on routines no one questioned. He could draw a map to the next site. He did one more thing without realizing its weight. He mentioned a recent sale, a blue minivan to a family in Springfield 3 months back, followed by a casual line about a friend in rentals who liked steady payouts and empty roads. Ellison closed her notebook like she was pressing a wound. Then the machine didn't stop, she said, and somewhere on Byway 7, a routine had already started its engine. They built the trap around ordinary things. A family-sized cooler in the back of a late-model SUV, 2 road maps creased by hands that wanted to be sure, a playlist soft enough to pass for Sunday. The volunteers were all adults, state employees with cover identities and nerves that didn't show. Agent Daniel Ruiz ran comms from a van disguised as a cable company truck. Detective Mara Ellison drove a plain sedan 2 cars back. Nathan rode beside her, an observer with a seatbelt cinched too tight, counting the miles he had already memorized. The target wasn't the family. The target was whoever had learned to time a life to mile marker 52. Harold Keaton had given them more than ledgers. He'd confirmed a name that slid out too easily, Dennis Keaton, a younger cousin who handled overflow and had friends who preferred quick cash to taxes. Dennis liked Byway 7 at daybreak. He liked gaps in patrol schedules. He liked a routine that pretended to be coincidence. Ruiz put eyes near the bends that erased cell bars, cameras tucked in brush like patient birds. If Dennis shadowed their decoy, the next move would leave paperwork. They rolled south out of Pelser as morning burned off the dew. The decoy SUV held 2 agents and a cooler of water that clinked like nerves in glass. Ellison watched the rear view and spoke in a cadence Nathan recognized from job sites when a beam went up and men below pretended not to hold their breath. "White pickup at our 9 o'clock, she said, slowing to match. Nathan didn't need the binoculars to see the type. Work truck with a magnetic logo for a fencing company that didn't exist. Dennis drove with one wrist on top of the wheel, head tilted the way people tilt when they're already calculating the next step. The first test came quick. Dennis surged, backed off, surged again, hunting a rhythm. At mile marker 49, he pulled even long enough to look over. The decoy driver did what a distracted parent might do, kept eyes ahead, rubbed the back of his neck, signaled late. Dennis fell in behind them and made the call. Ruiz recorded the length of the call and the tower it pinged like a fisherman marking the pull of a line. Ellison narrated distances as if distance were a thing you could command. 2 miles to 52, she said. Winds moving west to east. Cross traffic minimal. Nathan's fingers pressed crescents into his knees. He pictured his father tapping the roof twice and felt his throat close, not with panic but with a kind of cold resolve he hadn't known was waiting. Dennis accelerated again, slid left, then braked hard across both lanes, a diagonal block that forced the decoy down to a crawl. The move was practiced, almost precise, and utterly reckless. From the treeline came the echo of a second engine, the kind of hum that belongs to authority. A decommissioned cruiser nosed out with a magnetic light bar tossed on the dash, just enough theater to make a compliant driver roll down a window. Ruiz's voice cut clean through the radio noise. "Hold positions." No approach. No escalation unless fired upon. They had promised that no one would be hero or casualty today. Dennis opened his door halfway and used the door as cover, a show of control without a weapon visible. He lifted a hand like a man who's about to ask for license and registration. The decoy's passenger lowered his window 3 inches and held still. It would only take one wrong beat to fracture the day. Ruiz counted beats out loud to keep his team inside the plan. The wrong beat came from the tree line, not the truck. A third vehicle rolled into view on the shoulder, an unmarked SUV with plates that belonged to a church van in Conway and 2 men inside who were not going to services. They had expected to arrive unseen, to slide in and legitimize the stop with uniforms or something that looked close enough. Instead, they faced every lens Ruiz had hidden in the scrub and 3 unblinking dashboard cams. Ellison's hand hovered near the console switch that would flood the scene with sirens that never needed to sound. "Wait him," she said, more to herself than anyone else, "because patience can be the only control you have left." Dennis hesitated, chin up, trying to read a stage that was suddenly too crowded. He stepped around his door, and for a heartbeat Nathan saw what routine looks like the first time it meets a boundary it can't push past. A single crack lifted from the ridge, not frantic, not panicked, measured. It punched dust off Dennis's shoulder and into the air, a precise warning shot in the dirt beside his boot that said the performance was over. He froze, hands lifted on instinct, eyes cutting to the unmarked SUV whose drivers chose to look everywhere except at him. Ruiz moved then, not with bravado but with the efficiency of someone who has rehearsed this end state until the variables gave up. Units flowed in from cover, plain clothes became vests, and the air filled with commands that sounded like choices and were not. They took Dennis alive, arms behind him, the white pickup's engine still ticking heat. The unmarked SUV tried to reverse and met the cable truck's bumper, a soft thud that meant paperwork. The decoy family stayed buckled and watched the sky. Ellison exhaled the breath she hadn't acknowledged holding. Nathan did not cheer. He felt the smallest corner of life tilt back toward level and knew that even that inch had been expensive. On the shoulder, Dennis's phone lit with a text mid-cuffing. Ellison read it before the lock screen dimmed. "ETA?" it said. 3 letters. No name. No punctuation. A habit messaging itself. She looked at Ruiz. "The machine has more than one engine," she said. And somewhere past mile marker 52, a number Nathan had never called was already ringing. The confirmations arrived before sunrise, the kind of call that splits a life into before and after without changing the sky. Dr. Aisha Patel spoke first, voice steady, words measured. Dental records matched. Mitochondrial DNA confirmed. The Whitakers were among the remains recovered near the collapsed foundation off the Ozark Highlands Trail. Detective Mara Ellison called Nathan a few minutes later and didn't pretend the news would land softly. It didn't. He sat at the kitchen table his father had planed, hands flat, and let the room tell him what it had held for 20 years. He had wanted truth. Truth rarely wants you back. The service in Wichita Falls was small, real, and exactly enough. An old pastor who remembered Mark's habit of fixing things, on his way to somewhere else, read a psalm without grandness. A neighbor told a story about Elaine teaching her to make biscuits that didn't collapse. Rachel's friends from the street fair brought one of her woven loops and tied it to the bouquet ribbon like a quiet flag. Leah's library finally waived the fines and sent a handwritten note that said what institutions struggle to say, "We remember her here." Nathan didn't speak. He stood, he listened, and he learned how grief can be both a weight and a brace. After the last car left the cemetery, a man approached with the posture of someone who doesn't know if he's allowed to stand on the grass. He introduced himself as Mike Keaton, Harold's son, and kept his hands in view like a promise. "I found something," he said, and Nathan heard the careful layer of fear beneath the words. Mike had been boxing up the office after the warrants were served and noticed a panel in the back of a credenza that shouldn't have flexed. Behind it lay a narrow lockbox, labeled not with years but with initials. Inside, not money. Photos. Copies of sales sheets. Insurance summaries. And one folder that didn't match the pattern, Recent rentals through a chain in Conway and Branson, paired with travel consultations offered as a courtesy to large families. It wasn't nostalgia. It was continuity. Ellison and agent Daniel Ruiz met them at the shop that afternoon. Ruiz separated what could be used quickly from what would need time in a larger machine. The rental files were a pivot no one wanted to be right about. Names carried hope like luggage. Routes looked efficient until you saw what efficiency had been turned into. The best kind of shock in an investigation is the one that arrives in time to matter. Ruiz moved a team to the rental partner the same day. Phones were seized. A schedule with 3 circled weekends lost all its power in a hallway outside an interview room. Back at the cabin site, Patel's team did their work the way respect looks when it wears gloves. Each square of ground revealed a thread. Threads became a tapestry. The count rose and would keep rising. Ellison called families. She scheduled calls when she could sit in her car and let the air conditioner roar so she had something loud to push against after she said the hard parts. Nathan began to understand that closure is a word people use when they don't know the shape of the door they're asking you to walk through. Harold Keaton, confronted with the lockbox he did not know his son had found, did the arithmetic most men do when the narrative they wrote for themselves no longer balances. He wanted a trade, more names for the possibility of a smaller box to live in. Ruiz didn't offer absolution. He offered paper. Harold signed where he was told to, and for the first time since Nathan had watched him under those kind strings of lights, the salesman looked like a man who had run out of versions of himself to sell. Nathan drove back to the sinkhole one more time before the equipment left. It looked smaller in daylight, as if exposure had taken something from it that secrecy had lent. He walked the perimeter and read the land like a job bid, grade, run, material. He thought about all the ways men explain away convenience until someone draws them a map with pencil and patience. He sat on a folding chair past the tape while Ellison finished a call and watched a hawk trace a circle and widen it, as if to prove drift can be deliberate. The network began in a one-room office behind the garage with a thrift store desk and a list. Whitaker Missing Families Network wasn't a headline. It was a weekly call with other people who hadn't been sleeping well for decades. It was a spreadsheet of names, a guide to filing records requests without losing your mind, a phone tree for anniversaries and court dates. Ellison stopped by on her way north and dropped off a stack of brochures from victim services that didn't sound like pity. Mike came Saturdays and learned to hang drywall straight, the kind of penance that doesn't read like a performance. Ruiz called when another family needed someone to explain the waiting parts of the process so they wouldn't feel like the process was happening to them. When the dedication day came, a small sign bolted to the brick, a pot of mums, coffee in paper cups. Nathan said 15 words and stepped back. The sign wasn't a monument. It was a waypoint. He had spent 20 years building a life that looked like waiting and discovered that waiting done right is a kind of building. The lesson he kept is not tidy. Evil hides best inside routine, and routine prefers a friendly face. Systems fail where habits thrive unchecked. But memory can be an instrument if you let it, steady and exact, like a level on a beam. Ask the extra question. Write down what doesn't sit right. Share the map you wish you'd had. And when the phone rings too early, answer with both hands on the wheel.